Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Road to Disunion, Volume 2, Secessionists Triumphant, 1854 to 1861, by William W. Freehling, narrated by Charles Constant. Preface. In this second and concluding volume of my Southern Road to Disunion, Northerners sometimes step front and center to illuminate provokers, targets, and effects of Southern defenders' rage. But by usually focusing on aggressively defensive Southerners, I seek to resurrect their pre-Civil War political saga, one of America's most important and mysterious epics. The importance lies in the illumination of colliding democratic and despotic governing systems. The Old South combined dictatorship over blacks with republicanism for whites, supposedly cleanly severed by an almighty color line. But to preserve dictatorial dominion over blacks, the slaveholding minority sometimes trenched on majoritarian government for whites in the nation as well as in their section. These preventative strikes leached much of the mystery from Yankees' anti-Southern responses. Northerners called the militant slavocracy the slave power, meaning that those with autocratic power over blacks also deployed undemocratic power over whites. Most Yankees hardly embraced blacks or abolitionists, yet racist Northerners would fight the slave power to the death to preserve their white men's majoritarian rights. More mysterious is why Southerners risked a potentially suicidal rebellion against Northerners who disclaimed any intention of forcing abolition on Southern states. My explanation emphasizes that problems inside Southern culture nurtured both fury at any outside criticism and determination to prevent anti-slavery democratic discourse from seeping anywhere near despots' doors. The internal travail and its external consequences become clearest in widest perspective. Thus my first volume of Road, published a decade and a half ago, traced the democratic despotic section's political traumas from the American Revolution through the 1854 passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This sequel moves from that law's bloody Kansas aftermath to the Civil War's first blood. As the war nears, my narrative slows to detail the spectacles that started with John Brown's raid and ended with Fort Sumter's surrender. My slimmer epilogue volume, The South versus the South, published a half-decade ago, traces my Road to Disunion themes from Fort Sumter through the war. In this book, as in The South versus the South, and as in my previous Road volume, widening Southern divisions between regions, races, and classes frustrated attempts to forge a single civilization. To bridge potentially corrosive differences, late antebellum Southerners deployed even more intriguing pro-slavery ideologies and ever more zany political crusades. Because these initiatives failed, the secessionist faction of white Southerners considered President-elect Lincoln an immediate menace to their imperfectly consolidated regime. Most Southerners at first retorted that secessionists exaggerated the immediate threat and rushed to revolution prematurely. Yet disunionists strained, struggled, and ultimately secured a Southern majority, not least to preclude any Republican Party attempt for a majority inside the most exposed Southern states. The minority of the minorities stretch illuminated the tension that exists between majority will and minority power whenever democracy exists, and the deeper difficulty of a democratic resolution when a despotic social institution thrives. A wider understanding of why our peaceful democratic processes failed at home may temper overconfidence that American republicanism will always work abroad. Furthermore, slaveholders' intolerance for contrary opinion devastated our house divided, and a broader awareness of that historical lesson may spare democracies from some cries that disagreement proves disloyalty. Once again in this volume, I resist academics' tendency to maximize multicultural social history and to minimize mainstream political history. 4 million blacks' emancipation, for example, a central social history event, becomes unintelligible without establishment white males' political and military history. Instead of dismissing mainstream political history, social history must deeply inform it. Thus the nature of Master's dictatorship over blacks compelled their partial closure of republicanism for whites. Furthermore, the nature of slaves' resistances propelled their uninvited and important intrusions into white men's political upheavals. I here also resist academic historians' tendency to maximize abstract analysis and to minimize dramatic writing. I write stories about striking individuals and fetching places for deeper reasons than to make history intelligible beyond the academy, although historical lessons are too important to be restricted to fellow professors. Where many academic historians dismiss epic stories as old-fashioned fluff, I believe that classic tales of headline events, when retold from fresh angles, help sort out the culture's underlying forces. To take a prime example from the following narrative, a current historical wisdom alleges that Southern planters thought they needed fresh land in new U.S. territories to endure economically. Thus, the slaveocracy supposedly rose in revolution against President-elect Lincoln's threatened containment of slave power territorial expansions. Some parts of that abstraction illuminate some of the Disunionists some of the time, and many mainstream Southern political leaders before secessionist times. But right after Lincoln's election, as in the nullification and gag rule controversies of the 1830s, the first precipitators of secession, the Southern Carolina extremists, usually tepidly, if at all, desired territorial expansion. So, too, the most important territorial expansionists, the New Orleans urban imperialists, usually tepidly, if at all, desired secession. Moreover, neither the critical South Carolina disunionists nor the pivotal New Orleans Caribbean expansionists primarily craved agricultural profits from virgin terrain. Instead, South Carolina reactionaries primarily sought to shield their uniquely old-fashioned aristocratic Republican political system and their uniquely top-heavy slavery system from new-fashioned American egalitarian democracy. So, too, when territorial controversies became consuming, slaveholders' desire to protect their vulnerable peripheral areas from a neighbor's open democratic processes dictated which territories became most controversial. Sometimes the feared contagion of liberty involved British anti-slavery influence on the Texas Republic, sometimes Spanish Africanization of Cuba, sometimes Yankee free soilers' capture of Kansas bordering on enslaved Missouri, sometimes ungagged abolitionist debate in Congress, sometimes Lincoln's bid to build a Southern Republican Party in the border South. But always the clashing necessities of open democracy for whites and closed despotism over blacks strained the national republic toward the breaking point. Yet this narrative will fail if it only succeeds in substituting one theory about the impersonal causes of the Civil War for another. The following history shows that personal emotions exploded past impersonal drives, often uniting otherwise divided Southern whites in rage against Yankees' condemnations. Portraits of angry confrontations, not dissections of abstruse concepts, best lead to empathy with insulted combatants. Moreover, a dissection of detached forces, barren of accidents or coincidences or personalities, erases too much of the human condition. One of this narrative's climactic episodes illustrates the phenomenon. At South Carolina disunionists' critical moment, the impact of unexpected leaders, fleeting conspiracies, and one incredible coincidence boosted jittery secessionists over the top. The collision of despotic and democratic imperatives likely would have yielded disunion in other ways and or at other times if other characters or alternate contingencies had exerted sway. The odds against averting military combat in 1861 were large. The odds against avoiding some kind of civil war at the same moment were larger. The odds against abolishing slavery without bloodshed were larger still. But as gamblers forget at their peril, unanticipated quirks of character and luck can slightly divert the most relentless forces. Changes in how, where, and when a war commences can also condition the course of the war. Analysts of epics large and small thus must illuminate both the relentless forces and the little deflections. In that spirit, I offer this exploration and portrait of how secession actually triumphed, in the eccentric ways and at the memorable places, and during the suspenseful moments when extremists strove to sever one of the world's greatest republics. At the intersection of the colorlessly impersonal and the colorfully personal came the climactic fractures, and there I most cherish the storytelling style. My narrative style has changed more than my analysis during the 15 years since I wrote Volume 1. The aging process has sustained my taste for characters, locations, and confrontations, but I have lost some zest for nicknames, imaginary conversations, and plays on words. Changes in the Old South rather than in its intrigued historian compelled a stress on different background materials in the two volumes. Slaveholders' attempts at social control, whether over contrary blacks or whites, had to be spotlighted in Volume 1, for these social dynamics conditioned Southern politics from the beginning. In contrast, pro-slavery theorists had to star in this volume, for their intellectual gymnastics matured very late, not in the 1830s as is commonly supposed. Since each volume omits background information that clarifies its political saga, and because earlier and later political stories illuminate each other, the whole narrative becomes clearest when one experiences both halves. But once again in this volume I have strived to make half the epic stand on its own, this time featuring the crowning episodes on the road to disunion. During the half-century or more since Avery Craven wrote the last synthesis of the South's course to secession, many fellow academics have discovered additional pieces of the story. Some discoverers have been my friends during our shared decades of exploration, including Gene Baker, Ira Berlin, Dave Bowman, Bill Cooper, Dan Crofts, David Bryan Davis, Charles Dew, Ron Formasano, George Fredrickson, Betsy Fox Genovese, Jean Genovese, Jack Green, Mike Holt, Chaz Joyner, Gary Kornblith, Bill Miller, Willie Lee Rose, Ann Scott, Greg Simpson, Ken Stamp, Mark Summers, Steve Weisenberger, Joel Williamson, and Burt Wyatt Brown. I believe that we have together enriched U.S. slavery studies and that each of us has been the more successful because we have been together. I know hundreds of other fine scholars, mostly or only through their illuminating work. As my endnotes reveal, I have borrowed from them often, with admiration and gratitude. I am also grateful to the Horace Rackham Fund of the University of Michigan, to the National Endowment for the Humanities, and to the Guggenheim Foundation for financing my study of the many documents discovered since Professor Craven's researches. I am equally indebted to the American Antiquarian Society, to the University of Kentucky, and to my fine new professional home, the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities at the University of Virginia, for aid, comfort, and inspiration while writing this volume. My narrative would have been less effective without Sheldon Myers's editing and Dave Fuller's maps, but all professional debts pale compared to my obligations to Allison, who creates ever finer adventures than this labor of love. William W. Freehling, Charlottesville, Virginia, Christmas Day, 2006. The Road to Disunion. Secessionists Triumphant, 1854 to 1861. Prologue. Yancey's Rage. By the middle of the 1850s, William Lowndes Yancey and fellow secessionists had suffered through 2 decades as a cornered minority. During this exasperating time, Yancey perhaps dreamed that he would someday help prod half the South out of the Union. But the stymied Alabama extremist probably never imagined that he would surrender to a reluctant secessionist when secession remained only half accomplished. Yancey's abdication occurred in Montgomery, Alabama, provisional capital of the Southern Confederacy. The capitulation transpired on February 17, 1861, eve of Jefferson Davis's inauguration as president of the half-formed nation. Yancey introduced Davis, who had opposed secession as late as December 1860, by declaring that the man and the hour have met. The extremist thereby bet his revolution on a National Democratic Party moderate. Such opponents of extremism had long kept revolutionaries at bay in the South. Mainstream politicians' leverage inside the South began with their leverage inside the nation's majority party. For a quarter century, the Democratic Party's Southern establishment in Washington had secured many pro-slavery protections. With the Union featuring minority bulwarks, why gamble on disunion? And why doubly gamble on reckless leaders? Revolutionary hotheads had long been called fire-eaters. With their fiery rhetoric, they sought to incinerate the Union, whatever the risks. The less agitated Southern majority craved cooler rulers, especially during nervous revolutionary times. Even in South Carolina, the most disunionist state, cautious revolutionaries had to drive an outraged Robert Barnwell Rhett into the shadows before uneasy squires would dare disunion. Yancey, unlike Rhett, scored a revolutionary coup before succumbing to less revolutionary leaders. The subtle Alabamian, unlike the inflexible South Carolinian, saw how to turn mainstream Democrats' middle ground into extremist terrain. At the National Democratic Party's 1860 convention, Yancey used one of Jefferson Davis's watered-down pro-slavery crusades to strain the party past the breaking point, realizing that Davis's compromised Southern extremism might be too uncompromising for Northern moderates to swallow. So too, in February 1861, Yancey prayed that President-elect Davis, reluctant rebel, could lure hesitant Southerners into revolution. With such leery revolutionaries directing the revolution, Rhett answered, "Fire-eaters will only have changed masters." But in early 1861, Yancey knew that fire-eaters could not master the revolution. South Carolina's initial strike had provoked only the southmost slaveholding states into rebellion. The so-called Lower South included South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. Only in these 7 secessionist states did cotton reign as king, slaves comprise almost half the population, and enslaved blacks outnumber free blacks more than 50 to 1. Twice as many white Southerners resided in the less torrid, less enslaved, less secessionist Upper South, comprised of Border South and Middle South tiers of states. When Yancey conceded the Disunion revolution to Davis, 2 weeks before Abraham Lincoln's March 4th inauguration as President of the United States, the Middle South shunned the Lower South's republic, and the Border South had even less use for the revolution. The borderland tier of Southern states, located closest to the North, included Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. Here, the relatively few slaveholders almost never grew cotton. Here, 7 of 8 residents were white, while 1 of 5 blacks was free. Here, Yankee-style cities, immigrants, and industries were far more important than in the Lower South. The 4 states of the Middle South, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, lay between Lower and Border Souths. These Middle South states contained aspects of the colliding Southern cultures above and below them. Middle South fence-sitters might rally behind a Lower South moderate such as Jefferson Davis, but the Middle South shunned extremists, even an ultra like Yancey who sometimes found judiciousness useful. Yancey looked more like a judicious moderate than a fanatical extremist. Small in height, he was large in girth and fat of face. His half-closed eyes gave him a drowsy appearance. Under his double chin, his bow ties flopped in puffy ribbons. Over his slumped posture, his suits crumpled in disarray. Since inflamed nerves tormented his ribs and spine, he hardly moved as he spoke. Because he had no front teeth, his soft voice barely sounded distinct. How could such a motionless drawler arouse the sleepy to fury? Because both Yancey's legend and his vocabulary screamed that Yankees' libels demanded stinging retorts. According to the perhaps apocryphal legend, Yancey began storming at Northern insulters as an undergraduate. He then allegedly hurled a pickle barrel through a window at Williams College. The Massachusetts college supposedly disciplined the Southern native, whose aunt called him a youth of wild notions who never could rest in one place 2 months at a time. The wild youth belied his genial facade again a few years later when he gunned down his wife's uncle after an obscure affront. Still later, Yancey would end his career sprawled on the floor of the Southern Confederacy's Senate, blood spurting from his face after a fellow senator slit him with a jagged ink container. Whether he insulted or suffered insult, whether pickle barrels or inkwells or bullets augmented wounding words, Yancey, the fire-eater's most apparently becalmed orator and sometimes most disciplined tactician, always verged on reckless rage. Northern abolitionists especially enraged the Alabamian. The South's self-proclaimed paternalists, according to abolitionist sneers, presided not over Christian hearths, but over anti-Christian sewers. Slaveholders supposedly gutted black families by selling children from parents and parents from each other. The tyrants also allegedly trashed family life, white and black, by raping their female property. American Slavery as It Is, Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses, dwelled on these abominations. In this best-selling American book, beside the Bible, Until Uncle Tom's Cabin, the American Anti-Slavery Society called slaveholders as dead to their slaves' domestic agony as if serviles were cattle. In planters' houses, testified a Connecticut visitor, I could distinguish the family resemblance in the slaves who waited upon the table. Female slaves commonly have white children, and little or nothing is ever said about it. According to another Connecticut traveler, slaves lived in a state of promiscuous concubinage. Their master said he took pains to breed from his best stock. The whiter the progeny, the higher they could sell for house servants. A Borderite added that brothers and sisters, husbands and wives, are torn asunder. In every neighborhood, village, or road, one observes, the sad procession of manacled outcasts, whose mournful countenances tell that they are exiled by force from all that their hearts hold dear. By charging that slaveholders broke domestic hearts, abolitionists assaulted the slaveocracy where it claimed to be most virtuous. Southerners entitled slavery the domestic institution. The title asserted that slaveholding patriarchs treated all lesser humans, whether children or wives or slaves, as esteemed family members. Yankee capitalists, according to slaveholders' familial logic, had no familial compulsion about firing their employees or divorcing their wives, and now these anti-familial hypocrites cursed Southerners as family breakers. As William L. Yancey grew up, he closely observed a hypocrite who served his family. Yancey's father died when the lad was 3 years old. The proud, penniless Yancey clan faced a bleak future, but soon had appeared the ancient South Carolina family's self-proclaimed savior. The Reverend Mr. Nathan Beeman, a migrant from the North, taught at Mount Zion Academy in Georgia. This zealot married the widowed Mrs. Yancey when William was 7. Beeman scorned one possession of his new family. The preacher sold the ex-Mrs. Yancey's 3 slaves, a mother and 2 infants. The black family brought $700. A year later, Beeman moved his white family to Troy, New York. There, Yancey's stepfather demanded that the National General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church resolve that selling a human being as property is, in the sight of God, a heinous sin. Yancey recalled more than the moralist who pocketed $700 for indulging in heinous sin. Up in Troy, after Yancey's mother defended slavery as morally decent, Beeman banned her allegedly indecent opinion from his presence. He possibly beat her physically. He assuredly abused her verbally and sometimes nailed her in her room. She still called the domestic institution virtuous. Beeman responded that her reconciliation of the pure system of Jesus Christ with the abomination of slavery was a complete failure. Beeman sent the Christian failure down to the barbarous South for a year and a half of reconsideration. The exiled wife sought to bury the hatchet by dividing the blame equally between us. "I would be a fool or a knave," Beeman answered, "to admit any part of the blame. Instead, all our difficulties have commenced with yourself. His sole object has been to save your reputation and the character and standing of my family in a Christian community. Since Satan had forever blinded her to virtue, this once beloved but fallen woman must stay at the South and keep quiet, so that the disgrace and turmoil occasioned by your conduct may die away." When Mrs. Beeman instead came back to Troy, her spouse barred her at the door. Yancey's mother spent the rest of her life wandering between other people's homes, ever battling Beeman to see their daughter. As she eked out a miserable subsistence, her condemner spent part of his pulpit time castigating slave sellers who smashed black homes. To re-emphasize his self-proclaimed moral ascendancy, Nathan Beeman savored a pulpit that made him seem taller, and he was a huge man with a tough, square face, a stern expression, and spectacles that magnified his frowning eyes. When accused of sinning by selling his wife's 3 slaves, he dismissed the insinuation. He had merely swept the unchristian filth from his Christian home. Had he then been wrong to sweep his wife from her home? Of course not, he thundered. I shall never keep house with a servant of Lucifer a day while life lasts. Could the South reconcile white democracy and black slavery? Of course not, Beeman snarled. That brotherhood resembled an alliance between Jerusalem and Sodom, or a friendly league between an archangel and Lucifer, or the consummation of nuptials between heaven and hell. The slaveholders' loathsome political hypocrisy would make Benedict Arnold blush, and would lead Judas Iscariot to cast down 30 pieces of silver and go hang himself. Not for 100 pieces of gold could William Lowndes Yancey tolerate such slurs from such frauds. Whenever righteous Yankees heaped ridicule on Southerners, Yancey poured contempt right back. No American egalitarian could abide a critic's better-than-thou posture, nor could a slaveholder tolerate being labeled as scum. That epitaph only fits slaves. With whites being called morally filthier than slaves, Yancey the orator, that stationary drawler, needed no gestures, no screams to play on Southerners' prickly rectitude. In the South and in the North, too, this genial fanatic softly demanded that Southerners must be treated as Yankees' equal. "Do not destroy our self-respect, do not overtax our manliness," Yancey warned citizens of Syracuse, New York, under 100 miles from Beeman in Troy. "Do not walk in a field and tread on a caterpillar," he cautioned Boston abolitionists, "or the poor creature will turn on your boot and try to sting you." By insisting that Southerners turn on stinging moral enslavers, disunionists had long hoped to escape from confinement at the edge of Southern politics. For years, Yancey had prayed that Southerners' fury at Yankee maligners would someday defeat the compromising Jefferson Davises, propel uncompromising revolutionaries to power, fuse one South out of many sub-regions and classes, and burn the Nathan Beemans in a firestorm of revenge. But the pre-war question always remained, whether in mid-1854 or in early 1861. Could most Southerners' hatred of Northern critics overcome their love of Union, their dread of disunion, their divisions from each other, and their distrust of the fire-eaters? Part 1. Better economic times generate worse democratic dilemmas. During the first 2 decades of the slavery controversy, 1835 to 1854, the huge majority of Southerners believed that the William L. Yanceys counterproductively exaggerated the South's peril. Then, in the mid and late 1850s, a more respectable minority of Southerners believed that the secessionists offered a productive escape from imminent danger. Yet at the very time more Southerners saw themselves as disastrously afflicted politically, their economic afflictions largely lifted. Why should a sunnier economic outlook have coincided with a stormier political mood? In part because the South's stormiest disunionists, the South Carolina aristocrats, enjoyed less of the brighter economic prospects. In part because Southern prosperity elsewhere widened the section's provoking divisions, not only between contracting Southern Carolinians and expanding Southwesterners, but also between slaveholders and non-slaveholders, between Black Belt and White Belt areas, between the Lower South and the Border South. Meanwhile, at the very time that Southern divisions widened, Northern antagonism swelled. Never had the minority of masters in the South, or the minority of Southerners in the Union, or the minority of South Carolinians in the master class felt so vulnerable defending an unrepublican institution inside Republican government. Chapter 1. Democracy and Despotism, 1776 to 1854. Road, Volume 1, Revisited. As in Road to Disunion, Volume 1, let us focus on the immersion of the world's most powerful slaveholders in the world's most advanced republic, for that phenomenon most paved the Southern road to disunion. From the moment that road began amidst the American Revolution, Republican ideology and government posed special threats to despotism's anti-Republican essence. Yet the American Republican system also lent special protections to an aggressively defensive slaveocracy. The dialectic between extra threats and extra protection tipped toward slaveholder safety until the mid-1850s. Then the balance shifted at the very time the slaveocracy's internal divisions widened. 1. Where Republican rule over whites required free speech and the consent to be governed, dominion over blacks invited dictatorial compulsion and the coercion of the non-consenting. The slaveholders needed an almighty color line to keep such irreconcilable regimes severed. But the color line leaked. Whites freed some blacks. Some citizens became so-called poor white trash, trashier than slaves. Some masters used supposedly inferior blacks to direct their slaves. Many enslavers inhibited white anti-slavery debate, lest the enslaved or the citizens challenged despotism's compatibility with democracy. At their most undemocratic, white censors deployed lynch mobs, anticipating the most savage post-war South's terrorizing. Yet the Democrat in the slaveholder resisted physical violence against white citizens. Rather than
Sample complete. Ready to continue?